Hi everyone, welcome to our second lecture video. And so today I'll just be talking mostly about A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor, which is the only reading for this week. All right, so A Good Man is Hard to Find. A Good Man is Hard to Find is a short story, right, by Flannery O'Connor. Flannery O'Connor is an American novelist and short storyteller, short story writer, right? She's really known mostly for her short stories, other than her um, or she's known more, I think, for her short stories than her novels. She has two novels, and if I'm not mistaken, she also has two collection of short stories. Um, but but yeah, I think she's known more for her short stories than her novels, right? So she was born in March 25th, 1925, right, and then she died in 1964 at the age of 39. She died young because she suffered from lupus in sort of her mid to late 30s, right? And yeah, so she died young, and she spent most of her later life, right? Just she was born in Georgia, kind of grew up in Georgia, in the South, and then she spent most of her later life back in Georgia, right, where her mother sort of took care of her until her sort of in during her dying days, right? She 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 got her degree in creative writing at the Iowa Writers Workshop, right, at the University of Iowa, um, and the Iowa Writers Workshop is probably the most well known, the most prestigious kind of creative writing program in the country right now. Other people might disagree with that, but I think it might be, if not the, I think it might be the most well known, right? Whether it's the best or not, that's a subject for argument. But I think it's probably the most well known, right, in terms of creative writing, um, creative writing programs in the country, right? So she has this kind of background of being surrounded by great writers and working with great writers, right? And and she's also known for a style that's called the Southern Gothic, right? Which kind of it's sort of it has that quality um, of that shift, right, from comedy to tragedy, right? Gothic. Her descriptions are sort of um, she likes describing sort of decaying things, right? Or she likes to describe sort of tragic things or sort of disgusting things, right? Um, but she describes it in a way that um, also makes it almost funny, right? If not funny. Um, and so yeah, and so her style has been described as Southern Gothic because she sort of grew up in the South, and this is also during the time when she was writing during the 50s and 60s. Right, this was the time of desegregation, the civil rights movement, right, which means that there were a lot of changes in the South. Traditions were being questioned. Um, New ways of thinking, right, about race, about inequality, and segregation all these things, right? All these traditions, racist traditions, right, are started, are being questioned, are being sort of legally challenged, right? And so there were a lot of changes in the South that created this sort of conflict, right, between those who want to sort of move on and have a more sort of progressive view on things, and those usually older people who tend to cling on to sort of tradition and old ways of doing things, right? So there is that conflict, right, that I think she sort of you can sense it, right? You can see it in her stories. Yeah, so I think that's probably enough introduction about her. If you decide to, this is another thing, right? For your first paper, I won't talk too much about the first paper here. I'll talk about that in my next in my next lecture, right? But the first paper is arguing a position, right? And so for that first paper, I will let you either write about a good man is hard to find, right? Or you can pick, your own subject that you can, sort of write about, right? But as long as you're arguing a position, right? And the idea about arguing a position is really, you pick an issue and you identify two opposing views about an issue, right? And then you pick one side, right? And then you defend, you argue for that side. This position is right because A, B, and C, right? So that's the idea for the first paper, and obviously I'm going to talk more about that later on, or in the next video. And so you can start if you want to write about this short story, right? Start thinking about themes, right? About issues that is being tackled, right? In the story, and then identify opposing views, right? And then sort of see which side you want to defend, right? So that's something that you can start thinking about just by reading this story. But for this lecture, I just want to focus on what's going on in the story, sort of what themes might be included in the story, right? And so on and so forth. I won't talk too much about how you can sort of use this in your first essay, although I'll kind of mention a couple of things. So any lecture of stories, I usually start by reading the first sentence or the first paragraph, right? Because that's usually where you can see foreshadowing. You can see it's sort of the first sentence or the first paragraph. Usually, kind of it's the hook, as they call it, right? Although I don't like that word, hook, but it works, right? It's supposed to kind of tickle your attention, right? And so it should be interesting. It should sort of carry something about the story, right? It should tell you about what's going to happen later on. So I like to read the first sentence or the first paragraph to kind of get a sense of what the story is, right? So I'll just read it. A good man is hard to find. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the journal. Now look here, Bailey, she said. See here, read this. And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. Here this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is a loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida. And you read here what it says he did to these people. Just read it. I wouldn't take my children in a direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did. Right. So, so just by reading the first paragraph, we're introduced to the grandmother. Right. So there's plans of going to Florida. Um, the grandmother and her son Bailey, right, who lived with her. There's plans of going to Florida, and the grandmother doesn't want to go to Florida because there's this criminal that's been um, that's escaped the federal penitentiary, right, and is supposed to be headed to Florida, right. So, um, what else do we see here, right? You can immediately kind of sense that the grandmother is sort of um, she's not only concerned for her safety, right, but she's concerned about her conscience, right. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did, right. So there is a sense that she is a kind of she considers herself as a good, a virtuous, right, person. She differentiates herself from the misfit, right? She's not a misfit. She is, she's a good lady, right? Um, so you get that sense, right? And let me see. Yeah, and then it also foreshadows, obviously, the character of the misfit, right? Who we will meet later on. And then the second paragraph, Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around then and faced the children's mother, a young woman in slacks, whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage, and was tied around with a green headkerchief that had 2 points on the top like rabbit ears. She was sitting on the sofa, feeding the baby his apricots out of the jar. The children have been to Florida before, the old lady said. You all ought to take them somewhere else for a change so they would see different parts of the world and be broad. They never have been to East Tennessee. Right. Right. So we're also introduced to the children's mother, to John Wesley and June Starr, the children. We're also introduced to Pity Singh, the cat, right? But notice on the second paragraph, right, the way that O'Connor describes the children's mother, Bailey's wife, right? So Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around then and faced the children's mother, a young woman in slacks, whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage, and was tied around with a green headkerchief that had 2 points on the top like rabbit's ears. Right. So this is what I'm talking about, right? Of how she has a weird way, right, of describing her characters, right? The face is broad and innocent as a cabbage, right? So it's kind of funny, but it also sounds like she's making fun of these characters, right? So that it's worth thinking about, like why is she making fun of these characters, right? Like what kind of characters is she portraying by describing them this way, right? Um, yeah. So just on the first page, right, we get also a little bit of tension. Um, or towards the end, right? The next morning, the grandmother was the first one in the car, ready to go. She had her big black valise that looked like the head of a hippopotamus in one corner, and underneath it, she was hiding a basket with Pity Singh, the cat, in it. She didn't intend for the cat to be left alone in the house for 3 days because he would miss her too much, and she was afraid he might brush against one of the gas burners and accidentally asphyxiate himself. Her son Bailey didn't like to arrive at the motel with a cat, right? So she also wanted to bring to bring her cat, right? So um, even though the son doesn't like bringing the cat, so and you know, if you've read the whole story, right, this whole thing, it's the cat that sort of, you know, causes the accident, causes the whole family to get murdered, right? So this very act of bringing the cat, right, is very consequential um, to what happens throughout, right? So there is a sense, right? We get a sense that the mother is very stubborn. She's kind of annoying. She's very insistent on her ways, her, you know, old ways of doing things. Of, you know, she's very instructive. She likes to tell everyone what to do. Um, and so you can kind of assume that there might be tension, right, between the mother and the family, or the sort of the son and the son's family, right? So yeah, so just by reading the first page, you sort of get an idea of what's going on and what's about to happen, right? And what the characters are like, right? Um, but let's move on to the second page. And by the way, you know, there are no page numbers in this particular PDF copy, and so, you know, if you want to just keep track, there's only 13 pages, so, you know, just keep track by, you know, just write the page number, just, you know, if you want to keep track, um, yeah, just write it yourself. And obviously, you start on the first page, um, where the first paragraph is, right, and not the title page as page one. So the second page, page two, second paragraph, right. Um, Here is another description of the grandmother, right, and also pay attention to the fact that the grandmother is not named, right. She's just referred to. Bailey is named, the children are named, but the grandmother is not named. The children's mother is also not named, right. So the women are not named in the story. Just the, or, well, actually, so June Star is a girl, right? So she's named. Um, but yeah, the grandmother and the children's mother are not named. So, you know, that's not a coincidence, right? There's a reason for that, and, you know, it's up to you to think about what that reason might be. All right. So second page, second paragraph. The old lady settled herself comfortably, removing her white cotton gloves and putting them up with her purse on the shelf in front of the back window. The children's mother still had on slacks and still had her head tied up in a green kerchief, but the grandmother had on a navy blue straw sailor hat with a bunch of white violets on the brim and a navy blue dress with a small white dot in the print. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy, trimmed with lace, and at her neckline she had pinned a purple spray of cloth violets containing a sachet. In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. Right. So this paragraph, right, kind of, it immediately tells us something about the grandmother, right? She's very old school. She, you know, she wears cotton gloves, and she does all the things with the hats and all the little stuff that, you know, um, what do you call it, all the little accessories, right. And for no reason other than, or I mean, not no reason, right, but she's very, um, she likes to follow tradition, right. But also, in the back of her head, right, in case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady, right. So she's the kind of person that, you know, is very concerned about how she's perceived by other people in society, right? She's very concerned about her looks. She's very concerned about, how people will think about her, right? So that's another way, right, of kind of learning about the character, right, of the mother or the grandmother. Um, okay, let me see here. Also in this page, right, on the second page, as well as the third page, we see we see the characters sort of kind of discuss, right, black people, right? They encounter a black child while they were driving, right? And the mother said, let me see. Right, so on the bottom of page 2, oh, look at the cute little pickaninny, she said, and pointed to a Negro child standing in the door of a shack. Wouldn't that make a picture now? She asked, and they all turned and looked at the little Negro out of the back window. He waved. He didn't have any breeches on. Breeches means like pants, right? June Star said. He probably didn't have any, the grandmother explained. Right. So that, and then you go to the next page. We also see a scene here where the mother accuses a black boy of eating the watermelon um, that had sort of that was supposed to be given to her, right, by a suitor. And so we get like little glimpses here of so if you probably figured out by now, Flannery O'Connor and this family, right, they're a white family from Georgia, right? So we're seeing these events unfold from the perspective of white characters in the South, right? And the way that they sort of view racial issues, right, in the South. And this is what I mentioned, right? The historical context of O'Connor's story, right, is the during the time of desegregation, right, and so there are a lot of changes about um, how sort of black people, right, were treated. There are a lot of changes, but there are also a lot of people who are still very racist, right, and so there is that kind of conflict, right, and obviously the grandmother here is sort of more old school, and she has more racist kind of views on black people, right? She seems to want, right? She seems to kind of cling on to the days where there were plantation houses, right? And obviously, what comes with plantation houses are slaves, right? So she seems to kind of hark on those old days, right, where things were kind of great, right, for white people, that is. Um, so yeah, so we get sort of glimpses, and that's what something that O'Connor is also interested in, right? How sort of how white people, right, in the South navigated through the racial movements, right, the civil rights movements, right, and what their sort of view, right, sometimes kind of conflicting view of these racial issues, right. So that's something that's also here, if you'll want to talk about that, right. One way of thinking about the grandmother, right, would be to obviously she is portrayed here as kind of an old school, kind of racist, right. But but is there, is there something more than that? Is she just a plain old racist, or does she have a complexity? Does O'Connor gave her a complexity, right? And that's a position that you could also kind of, um, like your position should be complex, right? It's not enough to be like, oh, the grandmother is racist, right? And we know that, like it's pretty obvious, right? But a good position might be the grandmother is a racist, and she sort of embodies, right, a certain tradition that is racist, and because of the structural whatever, right? So that would be a good position to kind of argue, right? What does the grandmother represent, right? And what does her racism kind of represent, in a kind of larger political context? All right, so looking at page 4, there's another description here, that's kind of strange and funny, right? In the middle of the page, when the family stopped by kind of a barbecue, or it was like a restaurant, right? Sammy's famous barbecue restaurant. So the family stopped by this restaurant, right, to get some food, and they meet Red Sam, who owns the restaurant, and he and the grandmother seem to be on the same page, right? They seem to kind of um, hearken to the kind of they seem to have the same nostalgia, right, for the old days. Or he and the grandmother, it's on page 5. He and the grandmother discussed better times, right? The good old days, right? um, which usually means the racist old days, right? And so yes, in the middle of the page, there's this great description here. Red Sam came in and told his wife to quit lounging on the counter and hurry up with these people's order. His khaki trousers reached just to his hip bones, and his stomach hung over them like a sack of meal swaying under his shirt. Right. And this is something that you can kind of imagine, right? Someone with a kind of a big belly, but the way that she sort of described, that O'Connor kind of describes her here, right? A stomach kind of hung over them like a sack of meal swaying under his shirt, right? So it's kind of funny, but it's also weird that she describes them as, you know, I don't know. I'll let you think about this, right? It's almost like his stomach is separate from his own body, right? His stomach is obviously kind of, so the stomach is kind of like hung over him, over them, right? So his hip bones and his stomach hung over them. So it's like, I don't know, like O'Connor likes to kind of describe people's bodily parts, right, as if they're kind of disjointed or disconnected from each other, right? And I'm not sure what she's doing there, right? So that's something to kind of think about. Let's see here. All right, so they stop by Sammy's barbecue house, and then back on the road, right? And then the grandmother kind of remembered when she was young that they went, her family took her to this plantation, right? And she thought the plantation was nearby, right? So she told Bailey, her son, to stop and kind of, make a pit stop and check out the plantation, right? So they made a detour, right, to go to the plantation. So this is the move, right? Another kind of tragic move that the mother does, or the grandmother does, right? Where she's, again, because of her nostalgia for the old days, right? She convinces the family to go check out this plantation, which turned out to be the wrong place, right? It was in Tennessee, not in Georgia. um, or was it the other way around? Yeah, but either way, yeah, it was in right. It was not in Georgia. It was in yeah, it was in Tennessee. Um, but yeah, because of her kind of constant desire to kind of go back in time, she leads the family, to go to this place where they obviously get murdered um, in the end. And so, right, so another kind of if you're sort of tracing right what the role of the grandmother is, right, um, and what eventually happens to them, right, this would be like one way to do that, right. Her sort of bringing the cat, and then going on this detour, right, and then the cat eventually kind of um, causing the accident, which then led them to kind of meeting uh, or encountering, right, the misfit. Um, yeah, so they go to so they try to go to this plantation, and I want to read that part where um, they were about to get into an accident, and it's just a very it's a couple of paragraphs, and it's a very good description, right, of how sort of like of this description of like what happened, right, that led to the accident. So middle of page 6, right. It's not much farther, the grandmother said, and just as she said it, a horrible thought came to her. The thought was so embarrassing that she turned red in the face, and her eyes dilated, and her feet jumped up, unsetting her valise in the corner. The instant the valise moved, the newspaper top she had over the basket under it rose with a snarl, and Pitty Sing the cat sprang onto Bailey's shoulder. The children were thrown to the floor, and their mother, clutching the baby, was thrown out the door onto the ground. The old lady was thrown into the front seat. The car turned over once and landed right side up in a gulch of the side of the road. Bailey remained in the driver's seat with a cat, gray striped, with a broad white face and an orange nose clinging to his neck like a caterpillar. Right. So that's a very kind of like quick turn of events, right? Um, because the grandmother had figured out, right, that she is leading them the wrong way, um, that made her kind of jump on her feet, right, which then um, caused her to kick the valise, the luggage, right, where the cat was, and after hitting the luggage, right, the cat kind of jumped out, got rattled, and then jumped out, right, and then attacked Bailey, the driver, which then caused the car to flip, right. So this is the kind of like the short description of actions of the consequences of the actions, right. So throughout the story you can kind of trace what the grandmother did, right, that led them to this very event, right. But then even in this short scene you see how the grandmother kind of caused, right, this event, like she was the kind of um, she was the source, right, of the eventual kind of accident, right, because of her actions, right. So it's her actions, right, and that pretty much lead them to 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 where they ended up, right. Um, yeah, so that's something to kind of to think about. And then obviously after the accident, which to the kids was kind of exciting, right? No one really got hurt. Um, but then because of the accident, they encountered the misfit and his and the two other misfits, right? Um, and so kind of pay attention to, let's see here. So when we encounter the misfit, right, he seems to kind of um, he seems to portray himself, right, as a victim of circumstance, right. So there is a way in which, yeah, he's a misfit, right, and he eventually kills all these people. He's probably killed a lot of people before, right. But when he's in a conversation, right, with the grandmother, he's kind of we get us we O'Connor, right, kind of shows us the context of the misfit, right. How he was just kind of like a regular citizen back then, and he did all of these jobs. He had like regular jobs, right? And then eventually he did something we don't know. It's not. She doesn't tell us what exactly he did, right? That caused him to be put in prison, right? And then being put in prison in the penitentiary, right? That sort of just ruined his life. That kind of cost everything, right? To um, his life just kind of went downhill after that, right? But notice on page 9, right? I ain't a good man, but I ain't the worst in the world neither, right? So she kind of he defends himself, right? And why he seems to blame um, I don't know, like the institution of the prison institution, right? Maybe the religious institutions that condemn people like him, right? Um, whatever right kind of institution that condemn him, that led him, he seems to blame them, right? To um, um, blame them into like why he ended up, becoming the killer, right? That that he became, right. And so that's another thing, right, that you can kind of argue about, right, because O'Connor doesn't only give us a bad person, right, or a bad murderer, right. He or O'Connor, she seems to want us to consider him, right, the murderer, um, and sort of the context, like why did he become like that, right? What is um, and notice too, right? The misfit is not named. The two other guys that's with the misfit, um, they were named, right? What was their name? Let's see, Bobby Lee and someone else. Hiram, right? Hiram and Bobby Lee. They were named, right? But the misfit is not named. He's just a misfit, right? So there might be a way. There's a parallel, right, between the misfit and the grandmother, right? They're not named, so maybe that's because they stand in, right? They represent a larger kind of problem rather than a single person, right? So that might be another position, right? Defend the misfit. How can you defend the misfit? Right? I think there are a lot of ways that you can, and that might be a position that you'll want to argue about, right? Um, and then lastly, right towards the end, there's a lot of obviously the Bailey got shot, right, and then the rest of the family got shot, and the grandmother, right, towards the end get shot, and also like noticed how the grandmother got shot, right. I mean, I feel like she was gonna get shot anyway, but um, okay, so I'll read it. She saw the man's face twisted close to her own, as if he were going to cry, and she murmured, "Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children." She reached out and touched him on the shoulder. The misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him and, and shot her 3 times through the chest. Right. So she sort of she's trying to negotiate with the misfit, and she's kind of flattering him and telling, "Oh, you're my baby, right? You're one of my children, right? You're not a bad person." Um, and so she went in to touch his shoulder, right? And that kind of rattled the misfit, and then ended up, shooting her. Although I think he probably would have shot her either way. But yeah, so it's even until the end, right? It's still her own kind of actions, right, that led her to her own death, right? Um, and so yeah, so there is a sense that this story is very interested not only about how kind of like what the philosophies are of also, something that I want to mention is that O'Connor was a devout Catholic, although she was very, she's critical, and she has a kind of ironic relationship with religion, right? She sort of makes fun of her mother for being too religious, right? But she herself, right, practiced her Catholicism, right? And so you can see kind of a religious imagery, right? The snake, right? You see a lot of religious imagery here because of that background, right? And so there is a sense that there is a religious or philosophical kind of idea, right? A moral being told here, but there's also a sense that this is a very physical, or it's a story that deals with actions and the consequences of actions, right? As opposed to just kind of like some philosophical idea, right? Um, that there is a problem with ideas and philosophies, right? But there is also a problem with actions and how those philosophies get acted, right, by people. So that's also something, right, to think about, and how she sort of how O'Connor, right, portrays the idea of actions and the consequences um, of actions, right, and the kind of infamous, right, uh, sentence in this whole story, right. She would have been a good woman, the misfit said, if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. Right. What does that mean? um, yeah. So I think that's it. I hope you enjoyed reading the short story, and I look forward to discussing it with you on Friday. All right. Please email me if you have any questions. Bye for now.